Have you ever stood at a crossroads, facing a choice you knew would change everything? A path that, once taken, you could never turn back from? Most of us have. But the story I'm about to share with you today isn't just about one choice, but about its echo across generations. It's a story of a kingdom torn apart by greed, of a love betrayed, and of a faith that was ground into dust. And it begins with a terrifying paradox, a man who obeyed God and was punished with death for that very obedience. This story will take you from the heights of power to the absolute depths of despair. The hero you root for may not be who you think he is, and the villain you despise holds a chilling truth about human nature itself. And the ending, I promise you, the ending will change how you think about justice, about karma, and about hope. It is not what you expect. So, let's begin this journey together. But first, I want to know where you are in the world. Drop a comment below, let me know what city you're listening from, and what time it is for you right now. I want to feel our connection from all over the globe as we dive into this story together. And now let me take you to Ethelgard, the kingdom of gold and ash. In the golden age of Ethelgard, when its white marble spires still pierced the sun with arrogant pride, and its banners of the golden lion snapped proudly in the wind, an invisible fracture had already begun to form in the kingdom's soul. On the surface, Ethelgard was a perfect portrait of prosperity, but beneath that gilded veneer, a spiritual sickness was silently spreading. The ancient faith in the unseen flame and formless entity representing truth, heritage, and inner strength was slowly being forgotten, making way for a new rising power, the cult of the Gilded Serpent. This cult worshipped nothing intangible. They worshipped gold, power, and the immediate gratification of desire. The old, quiet temples were being replaced by opulent, cold halls where the scent of false incense couldn't mask the emptiness within. Into this volatile moment of transition, a single spark flared from the wilderness. A young man known only as the Prophet appeared. He had no name, for he believed himself to be a mere vessel, a voice for the unseen flame. His eyes burned with the fire of earnest and innocent conviction, an absolute belief in his divine mission. He was commanded by the flame to journey to the capital, to stand before King Valerius, who was idly tolerating the Gilded Serpent, and to warn him of the coming decay. The command came with an ironclad oath. On his journey there and back, he was to eat no food, drink no water, and never return by the same path he had taken. Each clause of the oath was a test, a trial of his absolute obedience. The young prophet arrived in the capital. He stood in the heart of the lavish court, where lords and ladies in silks and jewels stared at him with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. He did not flinch. In a voice that echoed with a strange authority, he delivered the flame's warning. King Valerius, an old and weary man, laughed at him and ordered his guards to seize him. But as the king's hand gestured, it suddenly withered and went numb like a dead branch. The court gasped in horror. The king, crying out in pain, begged for help. The young prophet, filled with compassion, prayed for him, and the king's arm was restored. That miracle planted a seed of terror in their hearts, and he departed amidst the court's stunned, respectful silence. The mission was complete. The young man turned for home, his heart filled with the joy and satisfaction of a faithful servant. He chose a different path, a lonely trail through ancient oak forests, his stomach hollow and his throat parched. But he didn't care. Obedience was his sustenance. But tragedy so often comes not from our enemies, but from those we trust. Deep in that same forest, a very old prophet lived alone. He too had once served the flame, but time and loneliness had eroded his faith to a dull memory. He had heard news of the miracle at the capital, and his heart stirred with a complex emotion, part admiration, part envy, but overwhelmingly a desperate longing for connection, for fellowship with a kindred spirit after so many solitary years. Seeing the young man pass by, a selfish but deeply human idea took root in his mind. He hurried after him. "Brother of the flame," he called out, his voice trembling with emotion, "I am a prophet, just as you are. An angel of the flame just appeared to me and said, 'Bring that young man to your home, give him bread to eat and water to drink, for he has done his duty well.'" The young prophet was stunned. He hesitated, recalling his iron-clad oath. But the old prophet, with his crown of white hair and eyes that seemed to hold a century of wisdom, was insistent. That oath was for the mission. The mission is now over, and the flame wishes to reward its servant. Trust me, my son. The innocence of youth, the reverence for an elder, and the gnawing hunger that tormented his body won the battle. The young man believed. He broke his oath. He stepped into the old prophet's hut. He ate the first piece of bread. He drank the first sip of water. It was the most delicious meal of his life, but it was also a poison for his destiny. As they were still sitting at the table, a horrifying change occurred. The old prophet's eyes suddenly went wide, no longer kind, but filled with terror. A power he had not felt in decades seized him, and words that were not his own tumbled from his lips. It was the voice of the unseen flame roaring through the mouth of the liar. "Because you have disobeyed the command I gave you, because you have returned and have eaten bread and drunk water in the place I forbade, your body will never return to the tomb of your ancestors." The young prophet was frozen in shock. The truth hit him like a hammer blow. He had been deceived. He rose without a word, his face a pale mask, and walked out of the hut, leaving the old prophet trembling in the grip of a devastating instant regret. He continued on his way home, but there was no joy now, only a cold, hollow emptiness. And then, as he rounded a deserted bend in the road, a great lion burst from the undergrowth. There was a single deafening roar, and then silence. When merchants passed that way later, they witnessed a bizarre and chilling scene. The body of the young prophet lay in the middle of the road, untouched. The lion that had killed him simply stood guard over the corpse, its amber eyes staring into nothing. Beside it, the young man's donkey also stood, completely unafraid. The two creatures, predator and prey, stood a shared vigil over the death of a man who had obeyed so blindly and disobeyed so innocently. His death became a legend, a whispered curse over the coming decay of Ethelgard, the first crack in the kingdom's perfect mirror, a warning that in the war of faith, even the best of intentions can lead to the most horrific of tragedies. The death of the young prophet was like a stone cast into a still lake, its ripples spreading ever outward. King Valerius, after witnessing the miracle and then hearing of the grim death, sank into a state of fear and indecision. He retreated into his palace, no longer daring to make bold decisions. The king's hesitation created a fatal power vacuum, and into that vacuum, the serpents began to slither out from the shadows. The swiftest and most cunning of them all was Lord Malachor. He was not the mightiest warrior, nor the wisest statesman. Malachor's greatest strength and his greatest weakness was his ambition. It was a burning, gnawing desire for recognition, for admiration, an obsession to escape the shadow of his unremarkable family line. He was weak-willed, easily swayed, and desperate for a strength he did not possess himself. And he found that strength, not in steel or coin, but in the woman who lay beside him each night. Lady Seraphina. If Malachor was the puppet, Seraphina was the one pulling the strings. She was not born of royal blood, but came from a minor priestly family within the cult of the Serpent. She possessed a beauty that was not just in her sharp features or elegant form, but in her cold, calculating intellect and her terrifying ability to see into the hearts of men. She could look into a man's eyes and see all his desires, his fears, his dirtiest secrets, and she knew how to use them. To Seraphina, the faith of the unseen flame was an archaic charade, a weakness for the sentimental. She believed in one thing and one thing only: power, tangible power, the kind that could command and be obeyed. The pair was a perfect destructive combination. Malachor needed Seraphina's intelligence and ruthlessness to climb. Seraphina needed Malachor's title and weakness to act as a screen for her own designs. They began their dance slowly. Seraphina, as high priestess of the cult, began hosting lavish ceremonies, decadent parties that lasted for days. She preached that the gilded serpent did not demand sacrifice or austerity. It bestowed wealth, pleasure, and power upon its followers. This message, in a kingdom growing weary of the old faith's strict rules, was like a cool drink of water. Lords, merchants, and even commoners began to flock to the serpent's temples. They didn't just come to pray, they came to network, to seek opportunity. Simultaneously, unfortunate things began to happen to those loyal to the flame. A powerful lord who refused to tear down his family's old temple died suddenly of food poisoning. A merchant who declined to donate to the cult was found robbed and beaten on the road. There was never any proof, only whispers and meaningful glances. Fear was Seraphina's most effective tool. And then King Valerius died, a quiet death in his bed. The official story was that he passed peacefully in his sleep. But the most trusted servants knew that in his final weeks, Lady Seraphina had been the only one permitted to visit him, to personally administer his medicine. Malachor ascended the throne in the most magnificent coronation Ethelgard had ever seen. He stood on the balcony, waving to the cheering crowds, his face beaming with triumph. But behind him, in the shadow of an archway, stood Seraphina, a cold, calculating glint in her eyes. She wasn't looking at the crowd, she was looking at the throne. The kingdom of Ethelgard was now utterly transformed. The ancient hymns were outlawed, dismissed as dreary and outdated. In their place were the loud, soulless tunes of the feast hall. Philosophers and scholars were exiled, replaced by sycophants and opportunistic traders. The temples of the unseen flame were demolished, their stones used to build casinos and brothels. Ethelgard was still wealthy on the surface, perhaps even more ostentatious than before. But it was the richness of a decaying corpse, covered in expensive makeup and perfume. Injustice became the law. The weak were trampled. The truth was twisted into whatever was most convenient for the powerful. The serpent's dance was at its peak, and the entire kingdom was whirling in its intoxicating rhythm, completely unaware that every step was taking them closer to the abyss. While the kingdom swayed to the rhythm of decay, in a remote place, high upon the jagged peaks of the Dragon's Spine Mountains, one man was listening to a different dance, a dance of wind and stone and silence. That man was Kaelen. Kaelen was not a prophet in the conventional sense. He did not receive clear commands or fiery judgments. He was a whisperer, the last man in Ethelgard who could still feel the presence of the unseen flame as a faint echo in his soul. He lived alone in a small cave, his only companions the eagles and the stars. His body was lean and weathered, wrapped in a coarse homespun cloak. His face was etched with the lines of wind and weather, and of a sorrow that never truly faded. Kaelen had not chosen this life of exile. This life had chosen him, after a tragedy had taken everything from him. Years ago, he had been a man with a family, living in a small village at the foot of the mountains. He had a wife and a daughter, and he loved them more than life itself. But he also had the arrogance of youth. He believed he was destined for great things, to revitalize the ancient faith. He was so consumed with portents and rituals that he neglected the simple things. He had not listened to his wife when she warned of the signs of an impending landslide. He dismissed it as womanly fear. He told her the flame would protect them. But the flame had been silent. The landslide came, a terrifying roar of earth and rock, and it swallowed his village and his family whole. He was the only survivor found clinging to a boulder in the wreckage. He was alive, but his spirit was dead. He fled into the mountains not to seek enlightenment, but to run from himself, from the silent screams of guilt in his head. He punished himself with a life of hardship, hoping physical pain could numb the torment in his soul. He was not a saint. He was a broken man in search of atonement. Over the years, Kaelen's grief settled, transforming into a profound stillness, a heightened ability to listen. He began to feel the breath of the kingdom. He felt it growing weaker, like a patient in a terminal decline. He could hear the cries of the oppressed, the arrogant laughter of the unjust, and the terrifying silence of dying values. He sensed a great drought coming, not a drought of water, but a drought of the soul that was about to consume Æthelgard. One evening, as he meditated before the small fire in his cave, an image formed in his mind. It wasn't a clear vision, but a feeling. The feeling of a lush green vineyard being squeezed by a giant golden serpent, its ripe grapes withering on the vine, and the image of a woman's face streaked with tears. He didn't understand its meaning, but he knew it was a call. This time, he could not ignore it. Perhaps this was his chance to atone for his past failure. This time, he would not fail. The next morning, Kaelen extinguished his fire, threw his coarse cloak over his shoulders, and picked up his worn wooden staff. He left the cave that had been his sanctuary for so many years and began the long journey down the mountain. The echo from the wilds had decided to speak. He didn't know what he would face or if he had the strength for it. He only knew one thing: he could not keep running. He had to face the serpent that was strangling his homeland, and in doing so, face the demons within himself. His journey was not for a god, but a promise to the ones he had lost. When Kaelen set foot in the capital, he almost didn't recognize it. The air was no longer fresh, but thick with the cloying scent of cheap perfume and decay. The once clean streets were littered with refuse and filled with beggars whose eyes were hollow and lifeless. There was laughter everywhere, but it was the hollow, brittle laughter of debauchery. He walked through the streets, a weathered, out-of-place figure amidst the garish crowd. He found a cheap inn and began to listen. The stories he overheard in the tavern, from drunks and soldiers and courtesans, painted a picture even more dire than he had imagined. They spoke of Lord Malachor, but always with a smirk. They spoke of him as a figurehead, but when they mentioned Lady Seraphina, their voices dropped, laced with a mixture of fear and a kind of sick admiration. They called her the Shadow Queen, a woman who could turn enemies into friends, and friends into dust with a single smile. And then he heard the story that made his heart clench, the story of a vineyard. Nestled beside the royal palace was a small but priceless piece of land. It was the ancient vineyard of Elara's family. It had been there for centuries, since before the capital was even built. Its gnarled, ancient vines had been tended by generations, and the wine from its grapes was not just a drink. It was a piece of history, a living heritage of Æthelgard. Its current owner was Elara, a strong and resilient widow. Her husband had been a soldier who died defending the kingdom, and she was raising her 2 young children alone, clinging to the land of her ancestors. The problem was, Lord Malachor, in his power-drunk haze, had decided to expand his palace, and Elara's vineyard stood directly in the path of his new wing. He coveted it. He summoned Elara, offered her a generous price, promised her a larger, more fertile plot of land elsewhere. But Elara refused. She stood before Malachor, unafraid. "My lord," she said, her voice calm but firm, "this is not land for sale. This is memory. Each of these vines was watered with the sweat of my ancestors. Their roots are entangled with the bones of my family. To sell it would be to sell my own soul. I cannot." Malachor, a man unaccustomed to being denied, was furious. But it was Seraphina who felt truly insulted. To her, Elara's refusal was not just a matter of property. It was a challenge. A common widow daring to defy the royal will, daring to cling to the very heritage she was trying to erase. Ilara, in her quiet defiance, had become a living symbol of resistance, and Serafina could not allow that. She whispered a venomous plan into Malakor's ear. A few days later, a public trial was convened. Ilara was dragged before the council, accused of treason. 2 false witnesses, bribed by Serafina, swore they heard Ilara cursing the throne and saying the unseen flame would strike Malakor down. It was a clumsy charade, but in a kingdom ruled by fear, no one dared to speak out. Ilara offered no defense. She simply stood tall, her eyes fixed on Serafina, a look not of hatred but of pity. The sentence was declared death by stoning. Kaelen arrived in the capital on the very day of the execution. He was swept up in the crowd that was pouring into the public square, and then he saw it. He saw Ilara tied to a post. He saw the first stones fly. He heard the terrified cries of her 2 small children from the edge of the crowd, and in that moment a memory flashed in his mind. He recognized Ilara. She was the daughter of the old village elder, his first teacher in the ways of the flame, the man who had tried to warn him about the landslide all those years ago. Kaelen's heart felt like it was being crushed by an invisible hand. This was no longer about the kingdom. This was no longer an abstract mission. This crime, this injustice was now a bleeding wound in his own soul. It was an echo of his own past tragedy, a replay of his own failure. He hadn't been able to save his family. Now he hadn't been able to save the descendant of his mentor. He stood there, frozen in the screaming crowd, and watched as Ilara fell beneath the hail of stones. Her blood stained the earth red, soaking into the very ground she had tried to protect. And Kaelen knew that his silence was over. The whisper in the wind now had to become the roar of thunder. The wrath of a righteous man is a fearsome sight, but the wrath of a righteous man who carries the grief of loss and the weight of guilt, that is a force that can move mountains. Kaelen stood in the blood-soaked square watching Lord Malakor and Lady Serafina return to the palace with satisfied expressions, and a fire he thought had long gone cold roared to life in his chest. He did not return to the inn. He walked directly to the palace gates, where 2 massive guards in armor bearing the crest of the gilded serpent stood watch. They looked at Kaelen, a figure in dusty rags, with contempt. "Be gone, old beggar," one of them growled. Kaelen said nothing. He simply met the guard's eyes. It was a quiet gaze, but it was as deep and heavy as the dragon's spine mountains themselves. The guard suddenly felt a chill run down his spine. He saw in those eyes not a plea, but a judgment. "I am here to see your masters," Kaelen said, his voice low and resonant, like a bell from a forgotten temple. "Tell Malakor and Serafina that the whisperer from the dragon's spine has come to speak." The message was quickly relayed inside. Serafina, with the curiosity of a cat toying with a mouse, granted him entry. She wanted to see this man who dared to challenge her. Kaelen was led through opulent hallways, the marble floors reflecting his own haggard image, a stark and ironic contrast. He stood before the throne, before the most powerful couple in Ethelgard. Malakor sat upon it, trying to look regal, but unable to hide his nervousness. Serafina stood beside him, a mysterious smile playing on her lips. "So this is the whisperer," Serafina said, her voice sweet as honey, but cold as ice. "What do you want here? Have you come to beg for a life already lost, or to curse us?" "I have come for neither," Kaelen replied. "I have come to make a proposition. You claim your gilded serpent is truth, is power. I say the unseen flame is the source of all things. Words are meaningless. Let power prove itself." He laid down his challenge. "On the next full moon upon Sun's Peak, the highest point in the kingdom, gather your 450 finest priests. I will be alone. We will both build an altar, lay the wood and the sacrifice. but we will not set it alight. Then you will call upon your serpent. I will whisper to the flame. Whichever of us can call down fire from the heavens to consume the offering, their faith is the true one. The loser will pay the price with their life." Malachor went pale, but Seraphina laughed, a clear, ringing sound full of derision. She saw this as magnificent entertainment, a mad old man, alone against an empire. She was utterly confident of victory. She could easily arrange a trick, use oils and tinder to create a flame. This challenge to her was a golden opportunity to publicly humiliate the old faith and solidify her power. "Very well, old man," she said. "I accept your challenge. Let the entire kingdom witness your foolishness and the power of the gilded serpent." News of the trial by fire spread like a wildfire. All of Ethelgard held its breath. It was no longer a contest of faiths. It was a wager of life and death. The day finally arrived. Sun's Peak was mobbed. People from every corner of the kingdom had journeyed to climb the mountainsides for a view. In the center, 2 altars stood. On one side, 450 priests of the gilded serpent, dressed in shimmering gold robes, stood in perfect formation. They carried drums, horns, and golden daggers. They radiated an air of arrogant confidence. On the other side stood Kaelen, alone. He stood quietly beside his altar, a simple pile of wood with a young lamb upon it. He wore his old, coarse cloak. His feet were bare, his matted hair blowing in the wind. He looked small, lonely, and hopelessly outmatched. The trial began. The priests of the serpent started their ritual. The drums beat a frantic rhythm, the horns blared. They danced and chanted the name of the serpent. They prayed from morning until noon, their voices growing hoarse, their bodies slick with sweat. But the sky remained a clear, indifferent blue. The altar remained cold. In desperation, they began to use their golden daggers to cut themselves, blood streaming down their bodies in a frenzied appeal to their god. They danced madly around the altar in a cacophony of screams and blood, but it was all for nothing. Seraphina, watching from a distance, was growing impatient. The trick she had arranged had been foiled by the strong, unpredictable winds on the peak. A flicker of worry crossed her face. Finally, as the sun began its descent in the west, Kaelen spoke. "Enough!" His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the chaos like a razor. Everyone fell silent. He walked to his altar and spoke to the soldiers standing nearby. "Bring me water, 12 jars. They were baffled, but they obeyed. He had them pour all 12 jars of water over his altar, over the wood, over the lamb, until water was sloshing everywhere, filling a trench he had dug around it. Now, lighting that altar seemed a complete impossibility. Then, in the absolute silence of tens of thousands of people, Kaelen knelt. He didn't shout. He didn't dance. He simply looked up at the sky and whispered, "No." His words were simple, not a plea, but an affirmation. "O unseen flame, soul of Ethelgard, let these people see, not my power, but your truth. Let them know that you are still here, still listening." The moment he finished speaking, an eerie silence fell over the mountain, and then from the center of the cloudless sky, a brilliant column of light, brighter than the sun, descended. It wasn't lightning, it was pure fire, and it came down with a terrifying, ripping sound. It struck Kaelen's altar. In a blinding flash, everything was incinerated. The lamb, the waterlogged wood, the stones of the altar, and even the water in the trench vaporized in an instant. The intense heat washed over the crowd, forcing those nearby to stumble back. When the light faded, all that remained was a patch of scorched, smoking earth. Sun's Peak was silent. Tens of thousands of people stood with their mouths agape, unable to believe what they had seen. Then, like a chain reaction, the first person fell to their knees, then another, then the entire sea of humanity collapsed, their faces a mixture of terror and awe. A single shout rose, at first timid, then growing louder, becoming a roar that echoed through the mountains. "The flame is real! The flame is real!" Kaelen rose to his feet, his face calm but his eyes filled with a deep sadness. He looked at the trembling priests of the Serpent, their faces drained of all color. He knew the terms of the challenge. "Seize them!" he commanded. The crowd, in their newfound fervor, surged forward, capturing all 450 priests. They were marched down into a ravine and executed. Kaelen had won, an absolute, undeniable victory. He stood on the mountaintop, hailed as a hero who had brought truth back to Ethelgard. He had avenged Alara. He had atoned for his failure. But he didn't know that in a war with a serpent, winning a battle doesn't mean you've won the war. And the Queen Serpent, Seraphina, though shocked, was far from defeated. She had already retreated into the shadows, and from there her venom was about to be truly unleashed. The fall of a hero rarely comes from an enemy's sword, but from the whisper of betrayal. Kaelen, after his resounding victory on Sun's Peak, made a mistake common to many heroes. He believed he had won. He believed that the truth, once so spectacularly revealed, would shine on its own and dispel all darkness. He had underestimated the cunning of Seraphina and the fragile, suggestible nature of the human heart. While Kaelen was still on the mountain overseeing the grim cleanup of the Serpent's cult, Seraphina acted with terrifying speed. She did not flee. She did not try to make excuses. She did something far more brilliant. She cast herself as a victim and painted Kaelen as a monster. She appeared before the public, no longer the imperious high priestess, but a broken woman. She wore mourning clothes, her face pale and streaked with tears she could summon at will. She did not deny the miracle on the mountain. She acknowledged it, but she reframed it entirely. "People of Ethelgard," she cried to the crowd gathered before the palace, "we have been deceived. This man who calls himself the Whisperer is no servant of the unseen flame. He is a dark sorcerer, one who has sold his soul to the forgotten old powers. The power you saw was not divine, it was black magic, an illusion crafted to mesmerize and to sow chaos." She continued, her voice choked with anguish. "Our priests who served you, perhaps they were mistaken. Perhaps they were overconfident, but they did not deserve to die. They were brutally massacred by a fanatic. He used his dark arts to create fear, and then used that fear to incite you to murder your own countrymen. Today he kills priests. Tomorrow he will kill anyone who does not bend to his will. Ethelgard faces a new tyrant, one cloaked in the robes of religion." Seraphina's words were a sophisticated poison, seeping into the public consciousness. They had just hailed Kaelen, but the memory of that destructive pillar of fire also planted a seed of primal fear in their hearts. That power was too immense, too terrifying. It did not feel like a benevolent providence, it felt like annihilation. And fear, once planted, grows far more quickly than gratitude. Seraphina did not order Kaelen's arrest. That would be a foolish move, turning him into a martyr. Instead, she issued a decree. For the safety of the kingdom, anyone practicing dark magic or inciting violence will be considered an enemy of Ethelgard. She didn't name Kaelen, but everyone knew who she meant. She had cleverly shifted the conflict from one of faith to one of national security. When Kaelen returned to the capital, he was stunned by the change. The adulation was gone. In its place were suspicious, fearful glances. The people who had knelt at his feet now avoided him in the streets. Those who had begged for his blessing now slammed their doors in his face. He had freed them from a serpent, only to discover they feared him, the liberator, more than they had feared the serpent itself. The final blow came when a group of city guards, not royal soldiers but a local patrol, stopped him. "We've had reports of a suspicious individual causing unrest," the captain said, his voice trembling slightly but trying to sound firm. "You'll have to come with us." Kaelen looked into their eyes. He saw fear, confusion, and ignorance. He could have easily overpowered them, but to what end? To prove Seraphina's accusations correct? To prove he was a man of violence? In that moment, a profound weariness washed over Kaelen. He had fought kings, priests, and magic, but he did not know how to fight rumors, ignorance, and the fear of the mob. He realized he had lost, not on the mountaintop, but here in the filthy streets of the capital. He gently pushed the guards aside and began to run. He ran without purpose, just needing to escape this place, to escape the eyes, the whispers. He was fleeing the very people he had tried to save. The pain of this betrayal was more bitter than Alara's death. It was a staggering, soul-crushing absurdity. He ran on, out of the capital, into the barren desert to the south. He ran until his legs gave out, and he collapsed under a withered thorn bush. The desert sky was vast and indifferent. The wind blew sand in his face, stinging his eyes. He lay there, alone, rejected by the world. The hero of yesterday was now a fugitive. He had done everything he was supposed to do, everything that was right, and his reward was solitude and despair. "It is enough," he whispered to the sky. "Let me die. Let me join the ones I have lost. I am so very tired." He closed his eyes, hoping that sleep would take him away for good, ending this painful, meaningless journey. The hero's shadow had finally enveloped him, and this time he no longer had the strength to fight it. In the stillness of the desert, where life and death are separated by the thinnest of veils, Kaelen drifted into a heavy, surrendered sleep. He dreamed. He didn't dream of fire or lightning. He dreamed of his family, of his daughter's laughter, of the warmth of his wife's embrace. But the dream quickly curdled into a nightmare. He saw them being buried by earth and rock, and he stood by, helpless, able only to scream in silence. He woke with a jolt, his heart pounding, a cold sweat on his skin. He was still here, under the thorn bush, in the embrace of despair. It was then, at his absolute lowest point, that he felt it. It did not come as a howling gale, or a tremor that shook the ground, or a fire that consumed the sky. It came as a gentle breeze, a cool breath across his sunburnt skin, a profound stillness that was not the emptiness of death, but the quiet presence of life. And in that stillness, a voice spoke in his mind, not a command, not a judgment. It was a question as soft as a whisper. "Kaelen, what is it you seek in death?" Kaelen was startled. He looked around, but there was no one. "Release," he answered in his thoughts, his voice full of bitterness. "An end to this pain." "And where does your pain come from?" the voice asked. "From their betrayal or from your own failure?" The question was a blade twisting in a wound Kaelen had tried to hide even from himself. He realized his despair wasn't just from the people's rejection. It was from the tragic replay of his past. He had failed again to protect the innocent. He had again brought only destruction. "I am only an instrument of ruin," Kaelen whispered. "My fire only burns. It does not warm." "A fire can burn down a forest," the voice replied, "but it is the ash from that forest that nourishes the new seeds. You have been looking at the flame, Kaelen, and have forgotten what it leaves behind. You have been so focused on being a sword of judgment, you have forgotten you can also be the hands of a gardener." A vision bloomed in Kaelen's mind. He saw the kingdom of Ethelgard fall, Malakor's palace consumed by fire. But then from the ashes he saw tiny green shoots begin to push their way up. He saw ordinary people, not kings or heroes, working together to clear the rubble, sharing their last pieces of bread, and building simple homes. He saw hope, not in grand miracles, but in small acts of kindness. "Ethelgard must pay the price for its choices," the voice continued. "But destruction is not the final purpose. Your task is not over. It has only just begun. Not as an executioner, but as a protector, a gardener." "What must I do?" Kaelen asked, a flicker of hope igniting within him. "You must find the seeds," the voice answered. "In the ashes of the kingdom there is one seed more precious than all others. An orphaned girl who carries the heritage of the faith but is lost in the darkness. Her name is Lyra. Find her, protect her, pass on the legacy you carry. Teach her how to cultivate, not how to burn. That, Kaelen, is your true atonement, not in death, but in life." The vision faded. Kaelen sat up, feeling a profound shift within him. The despair was gone, replaced by a new purpose, a sense of peace he had never known. He understood. He had been looking for redemption in all the wrong places, in self-punishment, in revenge, in the adoration of the crowd. But true redemption lay in giving, in nurturing the future. He stood up, brushing the sand from his cloak. His eyes no longer burned with righteous fury, but shone with a quiet, steady resolve. He looked north, toward the rotting kingdom. He knew he had to go back, not to confront Seraphina, not to seek justice, but to find a little girl named Lyra, to become a gardener in the middle of a burning forest. While Kaelen began his journey toward a new purpose, the gears of fate in the capital continued to turn. Malachor, having disposed of Kaelen, should have felt secure, but instead he sank deeper into a paranoid insecurity. The victory on Sun's Peak had not been his. He had been a spectator, and it made him feel weaker than ever. He knew Seraphina was the one in control, and that dependence gnawed at his pride. To prove his own strength, to assert himself as the true king, Malachor made a reckless decision to wage war against the powerful neighboring kingdom of Sildania. He believed a glorious military victory would make everyone fear him and forget the shadows of both Kaelen and Seraphina. Seraphina tried to dissuade him. She knew Ethelgard's army, soft from years of parades and banquets, was no match for the battle-hardened warriors of Sildania. But Malachor, desperate to prove himself, brushed aside her counsel. This was to be his war and his victory. Before marching out, as was tradition, Malachor summoned his prophets to foretell the outcome. But all the prophets left in the capital were the sycophants of the gilded serpent. They unanimously predicted a great victory. An old, loyal general, however, urged Malachor to seek a true seer. They found a blind prophet, a hermit living on the city's outskirts, who still held to the unseen flame. Brought before Malachor, the blind prophet, after a long silence, spoke. "My king, I see a ruler marching to battle who never returns. I see a crown falling into the mud and wild dogs fighting over it." Enraged, Malachor dismissed the old man as a fearmonger and had him imprisoned. But the prophecy planted a seed of dread in his heart. He decided he would cheat fate. On the day of the battle, Malachor did something unprecedented. He removed his royal golden armor and gave it to a general of similar build. He himself donned the plain iron armor of a common soldier and melted into the ranks. If fate was aiming for a king, he thought, it would aim for the man in golden armor. He, an anonymous soldier, would be safe. The battle was joined in the valley of the borderlands. As Seraphina had predicted, the army of Ethelgard was quickly overwhelmed. Their lines broke under the thunderous charges of the Sildanian cavalry. Malachor, caught in the chaos, was terrified. He was no warrior. He just wanted the battle to be over so he could return and claim victory, however fabricated. Meanwhile, on another flank of the Ethelgardian army was a young archer named Finn. Finn wasn't fighting for glory or for Lord Malachor. He was fighting for his family back home. He was the son of a retired city watchman, a family that years ago had often been helped by Alara, the mistress of the vineyard. When his family had fallen on hard times, it was Alara who had brought them baskets of grapes and fresh bread. The image of that kind woman being stoned to death had etched a silent resentment for the crown deep into Finn's mind. In the heat of the battle, Finn saw a hulking Sildanian captain in black armor cutting a swath through his comrades. He knew that if that captain wasn't stopped, his entire flank would collapse. He drew his bow, held his breath, and took aim. He calculated the wind, the distance. It was a perfect shot. But at the exact moment the arrow left the string, the Sildanian captain's horse slipped and fell. Finn's arrow, instead of finding its target, flew high, going astray into the swirling chaos of the Ethelgardian ranks. Malachor, trying to control his panicked horse, felt a sudden, sharp pain in his side. He looked down and saw a common, unremarkable arrow protruding from his body. It had found a tiny, fatal gap between his breastplate and the armor below, a vulnerability that only the most brutal and random chance could have found. The strength left him. He tumbled from his horse, landing in the thick mud of the battlefield. He lay there amidst the screams of dying men, looking up at the gray sky, feeling the life drain from him. He had not been struck by the sword of an enemy general, not felled by an attack aimed at a king. He had been killed by a stray arrow, fired by the son of a man whose family he had indirectly wronged. It was not a punishment sent down from the heavens. It was an echo from Alara's vineyard. A circle of cause and effect had closed with perfect grim irony. The blind prophet's words had come true. Fate, which Malachor had tried so hard to deceive, had found him, not through his crown, but through the arrow of a common soldier. The death of a king on the battlefield is often a galvanizing tragedy, a catalyst for patriotism and unity. But the death of Malachor was different. News of his demise and the army's rout trickled back to the capital not as a mournful trumpet call, but as a contemptuous whisper. No one mourned him. The lords who had long chafed under his rule immediately began their own schemes for power. The army disintegrated. The kingdom of Ethelgard, already rotted from within, now collapsed like a house with no foundation. For Seraphina, it was the end of the world. She had built her entire empire on the authority of Malachor, an authority she could control. Now her puppet was dead, and her strings were useless. She, the Shadow Queen, who had manipulated a kingdom, was suddenly alone and vulnerable. The lords who had once bowed to her now looked at her with the eyes of vultures circling a corpse. The cult of the gilded serpent, built on the promise of prosperity, dissolved as chaos descended. One night Seraphina gathered what gold and jewels she could carry and fled the capital in disgrace. She vanished into the darkness, leaving behind a kingdom consumed by the fires of civil war and banditry. What became of her, no one ever knew. She simply disappeared, like a bad dream at sunrise. Into this chaos, Kaelen returned, but this time he was not a fiery prophet or a hunted fugitive. He was a ghost, a silent observer. He walked through streets where factions fought, where homes burned, and where innocent people scrambled to survive. He did not intervene. He knew this was the storm Ethelgard had to weather on its own. His mission now was different. He began his search. He went to the slums, the refugee camps, the gutters of society where the victims of the collapse were gathered. He searched for a little girl named Lyra. He asked beggars and orphans, but no one knew her. Weeks passed. Kaelen's hope began to wane. Perhaps he had misunderstood. Perhaps the girl didn't exist or had already perished in the turmoil. He was close to giving up. One afternoon, passing through the ruined old market, he heard the sound of a flute. A simple, sad melody, but one that held a strange resilience. It came from a dark corner where a small group of street children were huddled together. He drew closer and saw the girl playing it. She was thin, dressed in rags, her face smudged with dirt, but her eyes were unnaturally bright. They looked like two stars in a moonless night. "You play beautifully," Kaelen said, his voice gentle. The girl stopped playing, and looked at him with wary eyes. "Who are you?" "Just a traveler," Kaelen replied. "What's your name?" The girl hesitated for a moment, then mumbled, "Lyra." Kaelen's heart seemed to stop. He had found her. "Lyra," he repeated. "That's a lovely name. Where are your parents?" The girl's bright eyes darkened. "They're gone. They were keepers of the old temple of the flame. When the Lord's men came to tear it down, they tried to stop them, and they—" She didn't finish the sentence, but Kaelen understood. He sat down beside her. He didn't offer empty words of comfort. He just sat there, sharing the silence with her. After a long moment, he reached into his pouch and took out a piece of dry bread, his only food. He broke it in half and offered a piece to Lyra. She looked at him, then at the bread, surprised. For the first time, the wariness in her eyes softened. She took it and began to eat, slowly. That was the beginning. Kaelen was no longer a prophet or a hero. He became a guardian, a teacher. He looked after Lyra and the other street children, teaching them how to find food, how to build a fire, how to defend themselves. But more importantly, he taught them stories. He didn't teach them of grand miracles or terrifying judgments. He told them of Ethelgard's heritage, of the courage of ordinary people, of the importance of kindness and integrity. He taught them that true strength was not in swords or gold, but in the bonds between people and the connection to the land that birthed them. Months later, when the chaos in the capital had finally subsided into a weary stalemate, Kaelen led Lyra away from the city. He took her on a long journey back to the place where his own tragedy had begun. He brought her to the desolate plot of land where Alara's vineyard had once stood. Malakor's palace in the distance was now a crumbling ruin. The land itself was nothing but weeds and stones. Kaelen knelt and, with his bare hands, dug a small hole in the hard, dry earth. Then he reached into his sack and carefully unwrapped something he had carried with him all this time, a small, living grapevine cutting, its roots wrapped in a damp cloth. He had acquired it from a vineyard in a distant village. "What is that?" Lyra asked, her curiosity piqued. "This," Kaelen said, a rare, warm smile touching his lips, "is a new beginning." He placed the cutting in the hole. "And it needs a gardener." He looked at Lyra. "Will you help me?" Lyra nodded, her eyes shining. She knelt beside him and with her small hands began to push the soil around the base of the tiny plant. The final scene of the story is not of a kingdom restored, not of a new king crowned. It is a simple, quiet image. An old man and a young girl together, planting a single shoot of life in the ashes of the past. They didn't know if the vine would survive. They didn't know what the future of Ethelgard would be, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that they were there together, planting a seed of hope. Kaelen, the Whisperer, had finally found his atonement, not in fire but in earth, not in destruction but in cultivation. He had become a gardener, and Lyra was his most precious seed. And the echo from the ashes was no longer a scream of pain, but the whisper of a new beginning. And so our journey comes to an ending with no castles rebuilt, no crowns bestowed, but an ending about a small act, planting a seed for a future yet unwritten. Perhaps that is the most beautiful justice of all. Not vengeance, but healing. Not punishment, but the chance to begin again. The story of Kaelen and Ethelgard reminds us that even after the most devastating losses, even from the ashes of despair, life can find a way to grow, and that sometimes our greatest role is not to be the hero who changes the world, but the gardener who quietly cultivates goodness and passes hope on to the next generation. Thank you for walking this emotional path with me. If this story has touched you, if it has made you think, don't hesitate to subscribe to our channel, because here we believe that every story is a world, and there are countless more worlds waiting for us to explore together. I'll see you in the next story.